Professor Tirthankar Roy. Professor Roy teaches economic history at the prestigious London School of Economics and Political Science, United Kingdom. His interest areas has been economic and South Asia history of South Asia, global history, empire and colonization, environmental history, and social history of humanity. His famous books include The Economic History of India 1707 to 1857, 1857 to 1947, that's the Indian edition. How British rule changed India's economy, the paradox of the Raj, and global economic history among many. So I hope everyone is ready with all years to enrich ourselves and with today's topic. And I now request Sir to carry forward today's evening.
Excellent. Many thanks, Odisha. Many thanks. And thank you all for joining. It's very exciting to be here because I'm meeting you for the first time. It'll be always nice to meet face to face so that I could ask you about your background and your interests. But in this mode of communication, that's not really possible. So I'll just start the lecture right away. But thank you for inviting me. So what I'll do now is first try to share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoints. Okay, so this was visible a moment ago, but now I can see it. Let me see. Ah. Okay, I hope you can hear me and you can see the screen properly. If not, just alert me. I'm not quite sure what I'll do, but hopefully this is all working well. Is it all working well?
Yes, sir. We can see and hear you well, sir.
Okay, excellent. Many thanks. Okay, so what I'll do today is okay. This is the broad title, but the title that Odisha has told you is absolutely fine. No problem. I am currently in Japan. My second affiliation is with Nagoya University. Sorry, I mixed up who you are, and I wrote Hindu College because I'm probably giving another lecture there, but you are not in that group, so please excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the economic history of European rule in Asia and Africa, which is actually a very rapidly developing field of research in economic history, my field. And it's rapidly developing because in many universities, economic history as a field is very West focused. It's very much concerned with Europe and North America. That's how it started. But it's changing now. And often, if you are looking for a comparative history of Asia and Africa, then in some way or other, you have to engage with this problem of the European colonial rule or empires. And of course, the British Empire is the big empire out there. So often in a course, in a program in economic history, your entry, the first exposure to the comparative history of Asia and Africa happens through a course on the empire. And I'm showing you this book, which I wrote with my colleague Lee Gardner, because I mean, to illustrate that point, I mean, this book actually came out of a course of the same name, and it's a very popular course in LSE. It's a kind of introduction to economic history of non-Western world, and we are now engaged in more projects like this one. But although it's growing, it's quite challenging to work in this field. Challenging because, well, there are, of course, regular data problems and uneven information. All sorts of things could go wrong. But there is also a big analytical problem there, which is whether we should treat empires as one state system with a single mindset, a single agenda, a single method of rule, and therefore a very well-defined set of legacies. Is that how we do imperial history? Is that how we compare, let's say, Nigeria with Senegal with India? or Indonesia, or are these empires in these places function very differently? Local conditions shaped how they were governed and what their legacies were. That problem is quite fundamental because without that, you cannot really start doing comparisons. So we are still struggling with that, but that's one of the reasons why it's becoming quite exciting to work in this field. In today's talk, I will discuss British Empire in India, not treating British Empire as a class by itself, the same thing wherever it appeared. No, not quite that way, but more focused on the particular conditions of India which shaped this state and the effects that it left behind. So, what I'll do today is study the economic impact of British colonial rule based on evidence based research, underline evidence based. It has to be accepted as valid evidence by other economic historians. I'm, of course, happy to answer questions on evidence, how economic historians gather evidence, how they process it, how they interpret it. What I will not do today is discuss popular history books or social media or blogs, because if you go out there on the internet, you will get huge number of opinions about what British Empire was doing in India. Most of this is political and very poorly educated opinions. They are not evidence based, and it will be a waste of time to engage with any of those types of material. I will discuss four topics or sets of questions. First, origin. How did the state emerge? Um, One of the things that many empire historians do is to try to understand legacies or patterns of rule by understanding where did the empire come from. And the empires did not come from the same kind of roots. Whether you are looking at Caribbean or South Asia or West Africa, the empire emerged um, differently, and these differences left some effects. So how did it emerge in India? And as we all know that it emerged from the activities of a merchant firm called East India Company. But how did merchants are not normally interested in taking over state power? It doesn't give them profits. So why did it happen? The second set of questions is the kind of political system or state system that was in place. It was, of course, a colonial state, which means that London or England decided some policies, India decided some others. So, how was that division of duties managed? How capable was the state? If there was an economic policy, what was it? On the third set of questions deal with the impact, economic impact, and the fourth with the legacy that modern India inherited from this state system. Okay, so to start with origin, um, why did the British Empire emerge in India in 18th century? I'll be mostly summarizing literature that others have written. I have also contributed to. As I said, British Empire emerged from the East India Company. They were merchants, not traditional warlords with who commanded soldiers. So it's a bit of a puzzle. Why did this body of why did this organization take over state power? What its motives were and what its abilities were. Now, one thing that we must understand to start with is that this takeover power almost never involved an outright conquest. Most of the biggest battles in 18th century, and there were many big battles. The biggest one was 1470-61. Most of these big battles, which involved thousands of soldiers and were very bloody, they were battles between Indian or South Asian forces, in which the company sometimes was an observer or sometimes was an ally. It's alliances rather than conquest that led to the emergence of this kind of power. Alliances were key. Alliances were struck all the time because this period in Indian history was seen a lot of conflicts, partly because of the collapse of the Mughal Empire, which unleashed a competition for political power or military power. The company, East India Company, it didn't really have an army, but it had a kind of a small navy, and it could also draw on Royal Navy. But most battles were fought inland, and East India Company, although it was a small army, was a any army was a handy ally for in this context. In this contest, however,
the fact that it could emerge as the most powerful state had something additional to that. It's not just the number of soldiers they commanded. I mean, there was something else that that had made them more acceptable, more powerful. And one of the theories that we have here to explain that is comes from the Cambridge scholars who wrote their best work in the 1980s, Bailey, Washbrook, and others, which, especially Bailey, which suggests that this is a merchant firm, and merchants and bankers were very powerful. They actually had grown in power in the native state, the princely state courts, after the fall of the Mughal Empire. And merchants saw European merchants as compatible people. They made secret alliances with them, and that turned the balance. Now, if this is a very interesting theory, and it kind of works for one of the three regions from which the East India Company's empire started. These three regions are Bengal, Malabar in Kerala, and the southeastern coast, the Krishna Godavari Delta. Now, of these three regions, the merchant alliance theory kind of works for Bengal. It doesn't work for Malabar all that well, and it doesn't work at all for southeastern coast, the Krishna Godavari Delta. So we need something else there, and the search for other answers leads to something that could be called military fiscal enterprise. Um, the company was, as the company was joining this battles, and as it was under attack in turn, it was trying to consolidate its military enterprise, and partly also because it was under threat from the French East India Company in India. So it had to do something about the army. And what it did was very different from an indigenous state. What it did was to build a standing army. Most indigenous states had contributory armies. That is, different feudal chieftains had their own loyal soldiers or horsemen, and they would join a battle together. If they all are loyal, then of course you have an enormous army, but very often the loyalties of these soldiers were to that particular chieftain, not for the state they were fighting for. So this is that kind of military model, if you like, wasn't always very effective, and it was increasingly becoming difficult to sustain. People were changing sides all the time. The company created an army from its central fiscal resources after it started controlling Bengal. And that army was maintained on the modern principles. That is, soldiers were salaried. They were not salaried employees of the state, not loyal to particular warlords or particular feudal lords. And that salary also carried a pension. So there was a sort of a different principle involved. I mean, it all didn't happen very quickly, but it happened over time. But this was a different principle, and the standing army was a much more effective army in the long run. There's another theory which these two people, Mondarok and Anand Swami, advance, which is that the company was a more credible ally because after 1772, the East India Company was being monitored by the British Parliament. So essentially, British state was a partner. I mean, it didn't actually manage what was happening in India, but it kind of guaranteed the company's commitments. So these credible commitments made a difference, and the company was a more credible ally. So many other Indian partners would deal with the company more readily than with than their rival Indians. No matter what, after 1857, when, as you know, a huge rebellion happened, the army was an extremely large force, about hundreds of thousands of soldiers, reservists, and it had grown very big. It had grown through the rebellion, and it was an extremely large army. I mean, essentially, the entire British Empire relied on the Indian army. The army was the Indian army. Navy was British Navy, but army was Indian. And with that resource, it could offer a deal to the princely states which were still independent, which is that you don't raise your army, we will subsidize your defense. If you are under attack by another Indian force, we will come to your aid. But you cannot raise a defense force. And that was the broad, general understanding with the princely states. And that lasted for almost 90 years. So that's the origin. Remember where we ended with this huge army, because I'll keep coming back to that point. Now, how was the Raj governed? How was the state governed? Well, this picture will give you a sense of the government. This is from 1875. The Governor General, the head of state, is the third man seated from the left, Lord Northbrook. And his designation was Governor General in Council. The council is here. I mean, all the other people are members of this council. So it's a committee. It's essentially a committee that ruled India. But that was only the Indian side of it. But technically, the definition of a colonial state is that it's always a divided state. I mean, it's different duties of governance are shared between the metropolitan center and the colony. So how was it done in India? Well, there was a Secretary of State, which is a ministerial appointment, Secretary of State for India, a minister of India. And he sat in the India office, which was the main center of rule of India. Other colonies were not managed by the India. India had its own India office. The most other colonies were under colonial office, which was a different body. The Secretary of State did not actually get involved in the day-to-day governance of India, but there were a few things where the Secretary of State was very powerful and the ultimate, the final decision maker. One of them was currency management, currency and reserves, exchange rate, and public debt. Public debt raised in London. So the London office dealt with the banking system of India, of England, the monetary system of England, the Bank of England all the time. So that was the kind of negotiation which the Secretary of State would do. And then, of course, if there are big geopolitical conflicts, let's say World War, the Secretary of State will have a lot of say. But in most other areas of governance, it was the Governor General who called the shots. The government of India was under a Governor General, also called the Viceroy and Council. The council members are experts on defense, law, infrastructure, taxation. For a very long time, the council was not had no Indian member, not even in the secretarial staff. So as you can see, I mean, this meeting is happening in Shimla, which is a hill station. And the council was kind of, if you like, very detached from the day-to-day governance, day-to-day, everyday life of India, if you like. But individually, these members were not bad. I mean, they were some of them were India experts that had written books, and they're quite competent people. However, there was nothing like remotely self-government or representational government until the interwar period when the council started becoming Indianized. Now, there was a third arm of the government, and these were the provinces. Now, as you know, Bombay, Bengal, Madras, these were enormous provinces, British Indian provinces. They're almost as big as 2 or 3 countries. Now, interestingly enough, the provinces were under governors who were the next level of rule. Interestingly, some of the most important developmental activities like healthcare, education, disaster relief, famine relief were entrusted to the governors, to the provincial governors. That is a problem because, as I will say in the next slide, this was actually quite a poor state. Its fiscal strength was very weak, and the provinces were even weaker. So some of the most important developmental functions were actually very underfunded. Now, if you are thinking of an economic policy then or economic system and ideology, then this chart may be helpful. It's militarily a very powerful state. I mean, there's no question about that. And the other element here is partly because of the East India Company heritage, but also because from the 19th century, Britain was industrializing and the whole world was either supplying raw material or buying British textiles and earn. So was India. So Britain was actually very keen to develop trade, especially maritime trade, but also internal trade. Now, these two things joined to create some kind of an economic policy. There was never an economic policy statement issued by the British rulers in India. There was never anything like a blueprint. This is what we are doing in India. This is what we want. I mean, there's no such statement. Individuals made statements, but not official statements. However, if you look at the state based on what it did, then this is what it did. I mean, it was a very authoritarian rule. However, it was committed to a very open economy. And I will come back to the second point in a moment. So what does that mean, an open economy? Well, it means that there was low tariff rates throughout the empire to facilitate trade, but also free movement of capital and labor. So if you want to move money from India to East Africa, you can do it without any problem. There is no currency exchange, I mean, minimal fuss, no problem. If you want to relocate and work in another country within the empire, you can do that with very minimal formalities. There has never been such free movements of resources ever again. Trade, of course, happens all the time, but this open borders to capital and labor is very significant. Of course, there is. It's not easy. I mean, it's not. It's expensive. I mean, if you want to go to East Africa to work, the transit cost will be quite high. You need to get some sponsors. So it doesn't happen every day. But officially, the barriers were very little, very weak. Now, what that led to is the following: that India was trading a lot. It always had a trade surplus. That is, it was earning net foreign exchange on the trade account. And with that foreign exchange, it was buying a lot of capital and skills. Many skilled personnel were hired by Indian companies, by institutions, by organizations, and the government. The government was one of the only one. So this is a general pattern of what openness meant for India. Now, how was this kept? Well, tariffs, of course, is one instrument, but the other thing was this, if you remember what I said a moment ago, the India office was controlled currency and exchange. Well, it controlled exactly to maintain openness. Currency value and exchange rate, if they're stable, that takes away a lot of risks of trade. So that was one of the duties which the India office was doing in consultation with Bank of England and other bodies. It also implied uniformity of commercial law, courts of justice across the British Empire, different countries of the British Empire. So, which means that if you have a dispute, let's say in Mauritius or somewhere, and involving an Indian person, then you could technically bring that case over to an Indian court and settle it there. So there was law was very portable across the British Empire. However, so that's the openness part, but the state itself was small, weak, and poor. Now that might seem surprising to you because just now I said it was a massive army, so I'll come back to that. If you calculate revenue to GDP ratio or revenue per capita, it was extremely small. It's smaller than not only Britain, very small compared to Britain, but also smaller than many colonies, which is very surprising. I mean, Ceylon, for example, or Sri Lanka was a much richer state. Why? That's another question. Now, this wasn't weak militarily because a large part of the revenue went to fund the army. That was one of the viceroy's main duties, which is to maintain this army. However, it was very poor in other ways, and that showed up in poor records of education, famine relief, and welfare. Now, why was it weak? Well, this is a very different state from the Mughal Empire. It's a different state. I'll come back to that in a moment. It's a different state because it's a truly federal state, which means that there is a central government, there are provinces, and these are all hierarchically related to each other. What they do are agreed based on a contract and agreement, and how they share the tax resources. The Mughal Empire was a tributary empire to a large extent. I mean, it had a central revenue earning system, but then many provinces were not part of that system. I mean, they would pay a certain tribute and they will be part of the empire. A lot of the taxes were retained locally to fund local chiefs, their armies, which were used in battles. Now, this is a different system. I mean, it collects all taxes which go to a central pool, and then it's divided up. So tax system was centralized, but for a long time the tax base was inherited from the Mughals, and that is basically a tax on landholdings. Now, tax on landholdings doesn't give you much flexibility to raise money because land is fixed. You cannot get more land if you want to. What you can do is improve the productivity of land and then earn more taxes, but there was nothing happening there. The productivity of land, as I will show in a moment, was almost flat. So, divided, land tax dependence gave a certain kind of depressed the government's earning capacity. And the government was struggling to get past that, avoid that, but it didn't really succeed very much. The other problem was divided government. The government could raise sell bonds in the London market quite easily because British Indian bond was valued there. It's a stable state, and people would like to hold that bond. However, it used that instrument to a very limited extent. It didn't like borrowing very much, partly because of this divided government problem, that these two heads of government both have to agree on something that they will use this public debt for. They used it for things like canals, railways, to fight wars, but mainly canals, but not really very often, not really for a general developmental purpose. Now, it might seem that this low capacity, small state is consistent with the kind of liberal economic ideology which Britain had at the time. Classical economists say that the state should be small and it should mainly take care of defense. That's the only public good that it needs to worry about. Everything else, markets will take care of. However, Britain itself was growing. British state was growing at the same time. So it's not as if Britain believed in that ideology. So it's more likely that India didn't really have much options to raise fiscal resources. So how should such a state shape economic change? I'll show you 8 areas where change happened or did not happen. To start with, again, going back to the military strength, which imparted 3 effects. One is, of course, the international borders were fixed. Possibly for the first time. They were mapped, they were fixed, they were defended. Similarly, internal borders were fixed, and you can see the gray shaded areas are the princely states or autonomous entities, and the white areas are the British India districts. However, so the border between princely state and British India was fixed, was defined. However, the princely states did not have any autonomy to create barriers to trade. So these borders were defined, but they were not part of any autonomous economic policy. So they could not, they could not stop, for example, a railway line being built through their territories or a telegraph line being built. And the commercial law made sure that people can actually move around this large area anywhere and start a business. So effectively, the internal economy was getting integrated. There was a market integration, and that was part of this deal that the British India struck with the princely states, that they will be party to this. And secondly, and the third thing was federalism, as I mentioned, that the tax resources were centralized. And now all 3 of these elements, if you can think about the present times, they passed on to the Indian Union after independence. Federalism, internal borders, and international borders. Internal borders, but the borders will not be used as a barrier to market exchange. These 3 things really emerged from British Empire in India. They didn't quite exist in this form before. The second effect that I want to talk about is something that some economic historians would call the empire effect, which is to direct trade towards imperial channels. So Britain and India will be trading more, and given that they had no tariff barriers, they traded a lot, and the volume of trade increased quite significantly, as you can see from this graph. From the little table that we have here, you also see how important Britain was for India, and India was for Britain. And the interesting thing here to note here is that in Britain was very important for India. It was the main destination for export. It was overwhelmingly the main source of imports. However, that level of dependence was declining very rapidly in the 20th century, which means that the empire was becoming less relevant for Indian economy. And that had some connection with the nationalist movement, which was also growing at this time, but that's a separate subject. On the other side, India wasn't really that important for Britain. In fact, the entire British Empire wasn't really as important for the British economy as we might think in terms of percentage share of trade. Britain was trading a lot, of course, but it was trading with the whole world and not necessarily empire. What the empire effect suggests is not that there was heavy interdependence between these two entities, the Britain and its empire, but that being part of the empire, trade grew more than it would otherwise if a country is not part of an imperial kind of system. And most evidence goes to show that there was something like this effect, both in the British Empire and the French Empire. The third thing that I want to show is this is based on national income, which is probably the only or the most important measure for how economic structure changes. And here we have two lines. I do not include the government in any of these lines. So I just divide the total real national income into two parts. One is agriculture, which is the green line, and the second one is the business sector, if you like, that is trade, industry, finance, other capital using services. And one line shows you the total income that is coming in from these two sectors, and the second chart, the chart on the right, shows you the average income. So that is the average income per person in these two sectors. So that's a measure of how well off these activities are becoming. And as you can see, there was a very systematic inequality between agriculture and the business sector. The farmers did not really gain very much, but merchants, bankers, transporters, those kinds of people really made a lot of money. So this was a good system for business, and that, of course, is very consistent with this trade graph, which shows a really remarkable, very impressive growth. A part of that business growth was industrialization. And it's not surprising that people who are trading, earning profits, will then think about other ways of using that profit. And one of the things that they were doing, especially given that a lot of these people were cotton merchants, and they were selling goods to Manchester, and they could understand very well what Manchester is using cotton for. They could see those machines at work. Their partners were Manchester capitalists who were either producing machines or owning textile mills. So it was not a big deal for them to enter into some kind of contract with machine suppliers and say, well, you bring those machines over to Bombay or Ahmedabad and let's start producing here. Now, that happened with textiles in a very dramatic way. India developed the largest cotton textile mill industry in mainly Bombay, Ahmedabad, later Kanpur, Coimbatore. And at the around 1900, 1910, India was the tropical worlds, the non-Western worlds. I mean, if you exclude Japan, Western Europe, and North America, India was the most industrialized country in the developing world. And it was not just textiles. Textiles was a main activity, but there was also a significant activity with metallurgy, which requires a lot more capital. And of course, we all know that the biggest example of indigenous enterprise in this time was the Tata Iron and Steel. Now, the question comes then, why is the system not good for farmers? Well, an open economy, trading opportunities, business opportunities, capital moving around everywhere, all that doesn't really affect agriculture very much, because what does affect agricultural productivity is not these things. Merchants who are dealing in agricultural products gain. Farmers don't gain necessarily. They need productivity of land, and productivity of land depends on environment. It probably also depends on institutional and political conditions. There is some controversy about how significant those factors were and what those factors were. But there was quite obviously an environmental constraint on productivity, which is that you can have plenty of land, but India is a tropical country, doesn't have plenty of water. And if you cannot have water, you cannot really raise land productivity. Getting water is often not a question of private investment, because sometimes in most tropical countries, the sun is so strong that surface water dries up, and you need either things like big dams or deep tube wells. I mean, these things are not cheap, and the state is needed as a partner for water. So that is the kind of condition that was not altogether lacking, but it was very regionally focused. I mean, the state was a partner in irrigation projects in Punjab in a very significant way, transformed Punjab completely. In coastal Andhra, the Krishna Godavari Delta, in deltaic Tamil Nadu, and where you have green revolutions emerging in the early 20th century or late 19th century. However, in most other regions, the state did not play a very active role, or probably there was no way that it could play an active role. The sixth thing that I want to talk about is the other the factor market openness. Now you have four pictures here which are very handy. The top one shows you Indo-European irrigation engineers in North India. This is not just an activity for engineers who came from abroad, but it was an activity which led to, mainly managing canals, which led to establishment of engineering schools, and one of them, the IIT Roorkee, had its origin in one of the schools. But there were many other examples of this kind. The second example is American engineers working inside the Tata Iron and Steel. This company relied very heavily on foreign engineers. A third picture shows you Ronald Ross, who is probably a familiar name to many of you, who isolated the malaria parasite, and a Nobel Prize winner. And his main work was in Calcutta City. I mean, he was a medical professional in the employ of the government. And then you have a picture showing an Indian general shop in East Africa. Now, just as people were coming from abroad, Indians were going abroad too. I mean, that was another empire effect. And there were diaspora forming in Africa, forming in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, everywhere. Just to summarize what these pictures are saying, it was extremely easy to hire a highly skilled professional, and many of them came to India to work on a variety of things, including tropical diseases, which had a very significant impact. I'll show that in a moment. Similarly, Indian capitalists went abroad. All of these are private sector flows, and there is not much controversy that they were very offbeat enterprises. They were making a lot of money, a kind of empire effect. Where it gets controversial is when governments hire people. Now, government is not a profit-making body. If Tata hires American engineers and makes profits, you can say that, well, that decision is good. When the government hires a British officer for a position which is not open to Indians and then pays very high salaries, there is a question. I mean, is it wasting money, or I mean, in a peacetime, that officer doesn't do anything. So when the government hires abroad, there is always a controversy, and this became quite a huge controversy among the Indian nationalists. This is the seventh effect that I'm going to talk about, the demographic transition, which shows the charts show the decade-wise average annual population growth rate, and then there is a fitted line. As you can see, the fitted line starts going upward from 1920s. Now, this is a massive, massive change, not just for India. It's one of the most revolutionary changes that the population growth rate goes up, accelerates very significantly. But it's also very significant for the demographic history of the world, because India had 13% of the world's population in 1920. Now, before that, you will see that the annual growth rate moves up and down. And the censuses start from 1872. But for about 30 years, it moves up and down, primarily because of famines and epidemic outbreaks. So the curve moving up is really an effect of a fall in the rate of disease deaths, especially these four: smallpox, plague, cholera, and something that was called fever, but it's not an identifiable disease. It includes malaria, influenza, typhoid, and a variety of enteric fevers. About most people who died in India in 1900 did not die of old age, but they died of one of these four diseases. And if these diseases didn't exist, then lifespans would be quite similar between Britain and India. There was a big spike in 1918 when this something like COVID happened, but it happened worldwide. So if you exclude that, the other diseases were very much focused on India. If you exclude that, then then these disease deaths starts to fall from around 1900. They fall to from 20 to 14 in 1940 over 20 years, and about 40 years, and then further on to 10 just after independence. So, I mean, one of the reasons, why this death rate transition happens is an open question, and there are many theories. But one of the things that was certainly working is this open market for skills. India became a major hub, a major center of medical microbiology research. And you know many of these names, probably some you don't. Hafkin, of course, is a very well-known name who developed the cholera and plague vaccine sitting in Bombay. There was Leonard Rogers, who set up a school of tropical medicine, and he was a big name in promoting a field called tropical medicine, which is largely centered in India. Then somewhat lesser known Charles Martin, who did research on plague, and then there's a gentleman in Punjab, a military officer called Bellew, who I think sanitary commissioner, who was working very closely with the Punjab states. The group photo is from one of the princely courts, and who did very significant research on cholera. Now, many of the big changes that were happening between 1880s, when bacteriology made its first major breakthrough, and the 1920s, when some of these diseases had very effective inoculation. That period, that transition was really, India was quite a significant player in that transition. On the negative side, and that will be the last slide on this set, there was generally poor record on welfare and public goods. Famines happened in the late 19th century, and the state did not act in relief. It kind of got its act together in disease control. It emphasized railways and more food transport, and that, according to new research, suggests that actually did have an effect. Famines effectively disappeared. The kind of famines that happened in the late 19th century because of droughts, that disappeared. However, it took some time and took a very heavy toll. India had one of the highest illiteracy levels in mid 20th century. Although its death rate had fallen, but it hadn't fallen enough. Child mortality rates were still quite high. So with that, I'll come to my last set, and I'll be quite quick on that, which is the legacies that independent India inherited from this economic system and the political system. Well, there were some institutions which British India left behind, which played a very critical role in independent India to grow, to create a development policy, and to have the means to implement that policy. Of course, army was divided between India and Pakistan, and in both cases, as you know, it's a very big resource. Um, and army was very useful for keeping internal peace and external borders. There were universities, especially in the port cities, which are world class at this time. At the time India became independent, they were very outward looking and were producing highly skilled workforce, and they also attracted highly skilled workforce. So that was a resource that very few tropical colonies had. There was a very strong business lobby formed of Indian people who had made their money because of, during this open economy, through trade, through banking, through commercial activities, through industry. And some of them, not all of them, some of them were partners in the independent Indian state and the politicians to create an industrialization policy. The commercial and corporate law was already there, and it has been there for almost 100 years. Central banking had come into being. Very few colonies had a central bank, but India had its Reserve Bank of India from 1935. So these resources were very, very handy. Um, there is a theory that, and of course, I mean, you can add to that a legislature, sort of a democratic setup, which for making laws other than the executive, and that also had evolved from 1919 in a different way from before that. And once again, I mean, that was not many tropical colonies had quite a deep-rooted democratic experience as India had. So with that resource, India embarked on an industrialization policy, much of which nowadays we think that were going wrong or unnecessary. But without getting into that debate, there was some of that development policy was a breakthrough. They were needed, and they were very badly needed, and where the British Raj had failed quite badly. The most important one is that agricultural stagnation was broken in the 1970s Green Revolution, which was not just thanks to seeds that came from abroad, but also because the state was investing a lot more money with a lot more energy on water. Something like 2,000 dams were built between 1947 and 1990, many of which in the driest places in India to capture monsoon water and supply irrigation water or supply the cities. That was an enormous change. All that, both industrialization and this kind of change, required the state to grow bigger. The colonial state more or less failed in that enterprise. The independent state succeeded. And finally, similarly, you can think of some good legacies which the independent state altered, it changed for the worse. The most important one was the deliberate barriers created against market integration with the world. I mean, there was a definite retreat from world trade not immediately after independence, but from the 1950s and 60s. India was withdrawing. I mean, its share in world trade fell quite drastically, whereas it was a very significant trading power before that. And resources were diverted from commerce and finance. Finance was nationalized to a large extent. Trade was very heavily regulated. And there was money shifted from these activities to heavy industry, chemicals, metals, machines, not textiles. Textile industry collapsed. And many will think that today that was an extremely wasteful pathway. In business history, you can see the downside of this. There are many international firms, many big textile mills. They are Indian owners at 1947, but they just disappeared. I mean, you can't find them anymore. And that disappearance was not inevitable. It was very much engineered by the state, and engineered by the state often to favor groups of businesses who were playing politics, and all that had a cost. So I think that's my last slide, and I'll take your questions. Many thanks.
I now request First of all, thank you, sir, for your valuable words. I now request everyone to put forward if they have any queries or questions. They can put it into they can write or just ask sir directly, or they can put it here in the chat box and I can read it to them. I guess there is no questions from anybody here.
Yeah, okay. I mean, if you do have any question or if you want to find out any further readings on some specific themes, you're welcome to send me an email and I'll respond to that email.
Yeah.
Somebody has raised the hand.
Yes, sir. He's raised the hand.
Sir, good evening.
Your audio is not good.
So am I audible now?
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So when we talk about the economic history of India, especially during the British era, deindustrialization becomes a big point of debate. So in your opinion, how much were the Indian gentries who actually owned a lot of capital at that time were responsible in not investing properly into the trade and industrial section of India, which might have led to India not becoming a capitalist country? So what is your opinion on this stance?
Yeah, well, deindustrialization is not just specific to India. I mean, the decline in craft industries happened worldwide. So some of it was not political, some of it was not purely, based on economic calculations. I mean, if you look at textiles, then India was a very big producer of textiles in the 18th century, but there was a significant fall in the textile industry. It did not disappear. I mean, that's the surprising thing. But there was a significant survival as well. But much of it went, especially cotton spinning. And but the other upside of that is that these resources became so cheap. I mean, the average cost of buying, say, a yard of cloth fell in the 19th century thanks to the Industrial Revolution by about 70-80%. So, which means that essentially a lot of the huge consumer welfare, consumer surplus that was created through the Industrial Revolution. So, Indian consumers were gained from that. Now, much of the current research on deindustrialization will say that, well, there was a decline in the middle of the 19th century, and then somehow the decline stopped. And then the craft industry started rising again. Now, that was mainly the handloom weavers. And but that's another story, but it's an important story. In terms of investments, well, there are. I mean, investments don't just happen. I mean, most people will invest in areas which they are familiar with, where they can understand the risks, and where there were merchants, there were capitalists who understood the risks, like, say, cotton textile trade or grain trade. There was a lot of investment. There was no shortage of money. I mean, if you are asking why the middle class didn't spend more money on business enterprise, well, there were, I mean, most middle class people would not understand some of this business enterprise. So they saved their money in other ways, some of which went to fund industry, some of which didn't. But why investments happen and why they don't happen, that's a more complicated question. It depends very much on what information you have about how to make money work. So it's quite possible that that information was not easily available. I mean, most developing countries it wasn't, or that the banking system worked for particular types of businesses, not for generally converting savings into investment.
All right, sir. Got a proper glimpse of what I was actually looking for. Thank you for that.
Sure.
If anyone has any other question, please. So then I guess there's no other questions here.
Sure.
Oh,
No, there is a question.
yeah, Mahua, right?
Right.
Good question.
Sir, I am Mohana Roy. I am
Yeah.
audible to all of you.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, sir. Sir, in our history book, in most cases, the most important chapter that also be held to all of us that the permanent settlement, the land revenue settlement of British East India Company, which ultimately created plantation economy and cash nexus in rural India, which was actually rural India. We at that time pre-British India, we meant that the Mughal India, which was the substitute and the self-sufficient rural economy that totally destructed through this the land revenue settlement, which ultimately objected to the maximization of revenue. Is it true or not? Properly true or not? And sir, even the question of deindustrialization, here we can't avoid the thesis that the total unemployment and the total destruction of artisanal class in rural India.
Okay. Well, on the second question, I won't make a comment because honestly, I don't have any data on unemployment, and I don't think anybody has data. But on the first question, the permanent settlement, I think you raised an important point. But we have to understand that the permanent settlement was. It was certainly a move to raise revenues, and it actually did raise revenues, but it was mainly confined to Bengal, parts of coastal South India, but mainly Bengal. So that's just one part of British India. In most other parts, there was no such land arrangement in place. And in terms of revenue earning, what was, I mean, it actually did deliver more money to the state treasury, but only for a time. After that, it stopped delivering more money. Essentially, what the permanent settlement was doing is to remove a lot of intermediaries between the state and the taxpayer. The ultimate taxpayer is the peasant. And so that gave a kind of benefit to the state, but only for maybe a few decades. And after that, the Bengal revenues were not growing very much. Essentially, almost any tax that is coming from land was inelastic after a point. That has a lot to do with the low land productivity, and that you can extract more, but only for some time, unless land productivity goes up. And it wasn't going up anywhere. It was probably falling in Bengal. But it is a Bengal story.
Any other questions we have? Alright then, everyone. I hope you have enjoyed today's session on a new economic history of British India, and all the aspirants of knowledge present here today shall cherish each word bestowed by Professor Tirthankar Roy. With this, we have come to an end of today's session. Wish you a very wonderful night ahead, sir, and all of the our students and other teachers who are present here. Thank you, sir. We are very much grateful for your honorable words here.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this session, and thanks especially to those who asked questions. Thank you.
So, Jayaditya Mukherjee has asked
Yeah,
for you.
I mean, my email ID is very simple. It's the LS email ID you can find online very quickly, but I'll tell you anyway. It's t.roy, t.roy at lse.ac, AC for academic, .uk.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
It's already night here, so good night or good afternoon,
Good night.
good evening, whatever. Yeah. Okay, enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.